Welcome to today's webinar, Achieving Productivity with Workforce Optimisation. Something that's become a little bit of a tradition in my webinars now is I'd like to start with a short story, and it's one that's stuck with me, and I think it illustrates just how easy it is for workforce planning to go wrong, even with the best intentions in mind. So many years ago, for about 15 years ago now, I was sat in a trust board meeting, and something quite startling happened. So we basically were told that a nurse had been working on the same ward for nearly 12 years. Now, that doesn't sound shocking, right? That's great commitment. And it's a big but, the nurse had been employed entirely through an agency for the whole time. So that was 12 years worth of agency spend to someone who was coming to the same ward week after week. Now, I know that sounds quite extraordinary, but it's very much true. And I won't name the trust or the individual, of course, but it was a direct result of having a lack of oversight in the workforce planning process. And the situation could have been avoided if the right systems, data, and communication had been in place. So why am I sharing this? Because I think this issue is an example of how critical workforce planning is and how easily things can essentially slip through the cracks. Now, I know it's an example of a nurse, and actually what we're focusing more on is probably the medical side of things, but it does give you an idea of the bigger picture of why workforce planning is so important. Especially in such a complex organisation like the NHS. I think people often find themselves juggling too many things, and as a result, you can miss out on the bigger picture, and in some cases is above some of the smaller details, which actually can be quite expensive and costly, especially when you're under financial pressure. But what if we could remove the complexity and break things down and essentially give ourselves a really clear path forward? And that's what I want to explore with you today. So before we get into today's agenda, I'd like to obviously introduce myself. My name's Phil Bottle. I'm co-founder and managing director of SARD JV. My background is in the NHS, in the workforce side. I worked in senior roles for a number of years, and I've experienced firsthand the workforce challenges that we'll be discussing today. We ran a webinar 2 weeks ago, and some of you were here. And in that webinar, we covered really the broader landscape of workforce planning, sort of touching on things like the Darzi report, the new focus of the new Labour government, the NHS improvement plan, and the need for a new approach. If you missed it, if you didn't see it, I think we've sent it to people as part of the invitation. But also you can get it from our website, or just let us know and we will get a copy sent to you. So today's session is slightly different, and it is different in terms of we're going to focus more on the new approach, and in some regards the approach that we've taken to doing things differently. I want to challenge some of the common approaches to workforce planning, and show you why they often don't bear fruit, and they don't always deliver the desired results. I think most importantly, I'll share why our focus is on the root causes, the problems, that not just the surface issues that are seen day to day, but the real root causes which actually form a barrier around good workforce planning. So I want to be clear, though, this is not a sort of a sales demonstration. I will be talking about our approach, but this is really about rethinking the problem altogether. So to do that, I'm going to cover a number of areas. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. It's not an interactive session at the start. These are more for you just to think about. I'm then going to talk about where people want to get to in terms of the outputs and outcomes of good workforce planning. I'll talk about the current approaches, something that I call cycles within cycles. And then I'm going to use a metaphor, the mountain in the sinking boat. It'll all make sense when I get there, don't worry. I'll then talk about how all of this has led to our rethinking of our approach to this problem, and hopefully we'll give you some ideas about how you can approach the problem. We'll then talk in a bit more detail about the outcome mechanics, so actually what the outcomes look like, what you should be expecting. I want to have a brief chat about ethical first, about what the focus of good workforce planning should be. I'll then run through a couple of or three real world case studies where we've interacted with trusts, what the challenges were, or what the solutions and the results of those were. And then we should have a period at the end, somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes if all goes to plan, for you to ask any questions that you may have. And I'll once again say, for those that arrived after I started, if you have any questions throughout, just pop them in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the session.
Just very quickly, Phil, you've got a notification in the top right of your screen for the calendar.
Have I?
Yeah, that was all.
Let's get rid of that. We don't want that. Okay, so I think where we'll start is with essentially some questions to think about. And one thing we do when we send the invites for this is we ask people to rate their job or their workforce planning process within the trust. And when we ran the last one, I think it was 4.2 out of 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. I added in all of the new responses, and it improved slightly to 4.8 out of 10, which obviously is a lot lower than people would want it to be. And some of the responses we got ranged from 0 out of 10 all the way up to 8 out of 10. Now, my assumption is that most people in this room or are dealing with workforce planning would much rather it be a 10. And I know that may seem unachievable, but it's certainly a goal that we should be aiming for. So the first question that I really want you to think about, and all of these are just to think about, don't need to answer right now, is what do you think it would take to get your current workforce planning process from your current score all the way up to a 10? I also want to sort of pose a series of questions as well, just to, again, get people thinking about the importance of this, and also the barriers that are holding you back. So what really is the biggest challenge when it comes to workforce planning and productivity? Is it engagement, getting people engaged in the process? Is it the consistency of the output from that engagement? Is it the oversight of being able to see the data, being able to make good strategic decisions based on the information that's put in front of you? Is it about being able to get good management information that you can then utilize for those strategic decisions? I then want you to think about a situation where, if you got your workforce planning right, let's say you got to the 10 out of 10, what do you think the most valuable problem you could solve with having a great workforce planning process would be? Is it improving patient safety? Is it staff well-being and safety? Is it reducing waiting lists, improving patient outcomes, reducing contingency spend, or just a reduction in your own workload? And then finally, the last thing really to think about is, what are the consequences if you do nothing or continue on the same path? As I say, I just really want people in the room and the people that are going to watch this video afterwards to think about those things, because for me, they're the crux of the core of why workforce planning is important. So let's now go to the end. Let's start at the end in this. What are the sort of outputs and outcomes that, when we talk to NHS leaders, they tell us they really want? What are some of those key areas that they hope to achieve through good workforce planning? So in terms of outputs, some of this is obvious. They were phrased in the question before, but they are about engagement. Now, engagement isn't compliance. This is not a tick box exercise to say I've got X number of job plans, for example, 100%. It's about individuals understanding why they're undertaking the process, what it means, what impact it will have on service objectives, on patient care, on the demand of the services. So it's got to be more than just compliance. If you do manage to get 100% compliance, that's great, and you do need good coverage, but it's the quality of the information that you get from that. The second output is consistency, certainly of the data that exists within workforce planning systems, for example. If the information is not consistent, it becomes difficult to compare it, to understand it, and to be able to make decisions of it. Oversight, as I mentioned in one of the questions, that's really important. Oversight of the data for the trusts and services. Just having a picture of what your workforce looks like, being able to understand what your capacity actually is and how that measures up against your demand. Sustainability. We're going to be talking about solutions, and I think one of the things that organizations don't want when we talk to them is expensive solutions that act as a crutch basically to that organization that they have to utilize again and again and again, because trusts and services are already under severe financial pressure. So it needs to be a solution that can be sustained year after year without adding to that burden. And then obviously productivity, an organized workforce where you can get the most out of the resource that you have. And as I mentioned in the last webinar, this is not about squeezing more, asking people to do more. This is about making sure you can cut out areas that are maybe not as productive or reallocate resources. So the overarching outcome of all of this is to have a productive, optimized workforce. When I talk about optimized, I don't mean silver bullet, go through a program or engage with a service and then suddenly you don't have any workforce issues. This is as much about making sure that you get the best out of what you've got and you identify the areas where you need to maybe invest more or move resource around. All with the aim of having a positive impact on the things that I've already mentioned before: patient safety and improving patient outcomes, staff safety and well-being, avoiding burnout, and then things like reduction in contingency spend and waiting lists. These are all really important areas that align with the NHS's mission that we should be aiming towards. So what are the current approaches? I think there's multiple solutions that trust can engage with when they're trying to tackle the workforce planning and productivity issues. And I've listed some of them here: systems, training, policy review, bringing in external consultants, organizational restructure, utilizing contingency, agency staff, process redesign, engagement and comms initiatives, performance audits and data reviews. Some of them are maybe more relevant in different situations than others. Some of them are more expensive than others, but they're all potential tools that can be used to improve the workforce planning process. I would say, though, in my experience, when it comes to workforce planning, outside of utilizing contingency staff to plug the gaps, that there's really 4 key areas that trust focus on. And they're the top 4 really: systems, training, policy, and consultancy. And I think actually they're the go-to solutions for most or a multitude of internal processes when they need to be renewed or improved. But what I often noticed when I was in the NHS, and I notice it now when we talk to people, is that when these solutions are deployed, they turn into something I like to call cycles within cycles. And I'll give you an example of that. We'll focus on job planning. So what is cycles within cycles? Well, essentially, it's when you focus on sort of one aspect of job planning, for example, something I'm sure everyone in here is very familiar with. Most trusts, not all, I appreciate there's some that do really well on this, but most trusts struggle with engagement when it comes to getting job planning done. And that may be low compliance, but but on the whole, it's low engagement. And it tends to be a perpetual cycle. So when you're tackling this, and if I may, if we start off by agreeing what the purpose of job planning is, which is essentially to give you a clear view of your plan capacity, and in most cases that's with your medical workforce, in order to meet the demands on your service. So here's my take on what typically happens within this initial cycle. First, the trust will go and buy a system in the hopes of gaining that clarity. What they find often, the outcome is poor engagement and a lack of useful data. So then they may move on to another area of the cycle, which is, okay, well, let's run some training to boost engagement. You may see a marginal gain, but often the outcome is still not a great improvement. The engagement remains low, and because the engagement is low, the data that you can draw from that is still lacking. Again, you can move on. You can think about implementing new policies. But again, what we're seeing as we've worked with trusts over the last decade and a half is there's still no tangible change. Engagement still remains low, and again, therefore, data. Another area they can go to is external consultants for guidance or audits. Again, problems still persist. We don't see any noticeable change or uptake in job planning around those areas. So then you come back to the first part of the cycle, and this is where there's cycles within cycles. People often say, well, maybe it's the system. Maybe I need a system with better features or easier interfaces. So they move systems. Still the same problem persists. So despite the new system, the core issues sort of remain unresolved. And I think the reason why is because they missed the bigger picture. They failed to overcome things like cultural resistance, for example, and they're more procedural. And they definitely don't address what I believe, and I think, we hear a lot, are the real core, the root causes, the core issues and barriers to good workforce planning, which are actually quite simple when you break them down. It's time, capacity, and capability. And as a result, the trust ends up basically reacting to the immediate problems that are presented by the solution that they've got, rather than actually getting ahead of the problem. And whilst you can get small gains for a period, they're often not sustained. I have seen trusts that do manage to make good gains around job planning, but actually it tends to be the people that are involved in the process which sometimes compensate for the solutions that they've brought in. And it's wonderful to see that there's lots of great people out there doing great work, but we need to make this simpler and easier to manage. So this misfocus can lead to this loop, this cycling through solutions that don't address the root causes and basically keep us in reactive mode. I also mentioned in the last webinar, and particularly with systems, is you tend to see something that we term as feature bloat. So services trust tend to ask for the system to do more, something outside of its original remit, to potentially deal with the issue around something like engagement. But what it tends to do is it adds complexity to that system because it was designed for a different purpose. But to press home this point, I want to talk about essentially a problem that was presented to me some time ago by someone, which again has stuck with me. And it's basically the mountain and the sinking boat. And for me, it perfectly illustrates why this cycle persists. It's pretty simple, but I think it's pretty powerful. So the first thing you have to do is imagine that you're standing at the base of a mountain and you've got some tools and a clear goal. You need to get over the mountain to reach safety. It's a challenge, but it is possible, even with your limited knowledge and ability and time. Now imagine that you're not actually standing on solid ground, that you're in a sinking boat floating at the base of that mountain. You know that safety is on the other side, but in order to get there, you need to climb over it still. And the mountain is pretty daunting. But the immediate crisis is bailing out the boat to keep yourself afloat. So this gives you a choice when you're limited in time, capacity, and capability, for example. Do you concentrate on bailing out the boat to stay afloat, or do you risk the boat sinking whilst you learn the skills and gather the tools needed to basically safely climb over that mountain? And this is what I imagine it feels like for many NHS trusts when they're trying to tackle workforce planning. It's so busy dealing with the immediate pressures, the day-to-day, the keeping the boat afloat, that you don't always have the time and capacity to climb over that mountain or fix the bigger problems to get ahead of the problem as such. So instead, you get stuck in this reactive cycle, trying to plug the holes as they appear. The big question is how do you solve the mountain and the boat problem? Well, the answer is going to seem pretty simple and in itself maybe pretty unachievable, but you remove the mountain. And I think, as I say, I know no one is physically talking, but I can hear people thinking, well, that is much easier said than done. And I think with traditional methods, that is absolutely true. It is difficult to do, and it may feel like it's impossible. It really leads to the question, well, how do you make more time? How do you get more capacity? And how do you increase your capability when you're already under pressure? And I think this is where the requirement for a new approach comes in. And it's something we've thought about a lot. It's important not to focus on the surface issues, the things that actually solutions present to you, and is to focus on eliminating those root causes. And I think once we realized that the problem isn't about making systems better or adding more features or making them easier to use, which of course is really important. I'm not denying that is important. Systems should always be simpler to use. They should always be as effective as possible. But that alone, or adding more training or rewriting a policy in isolation, is not necessarily the answer to this. That's still trying to climb over the mountain. So we focused on how you can remove time, capacity, and capability barriers that are essentially faced by most trusts that we speak to. The focus had to be on getting out of the cycle and achieving real progress. So if we do create more time, we can not only make that process, we can also fix the boat, which is important as well, because that boat's going to be required, you know, if you consider that as a job planning system, for example. But also by removing the mountain, you bring the goal much closer to you. So it doesn't seem so distant. It doesn't seem so daunting. And actually you can get to where you need to be quicker, which is always a benefit, especially if the quality is there. So I suppose the next question is, how do we do it? You know, not is this our aim, but actually how do we tangibly do this? And when I start to describe to you, you can be forgiven in thinking that this sounds like the cycles within cycles problem that we were just talking about, but there are two very big differences to the approach. So the first thing is you'll notice these are traditional solutions: data, analytics, training or skills transfer, the use of expertise, and the use of tools. But one of the big differences is this is a holistic approach. This is a simultaneous approach. These are delivered as one, not as individually focused solutions that the cycle talked about. Start with systems, then training, then policies, then consultancy. This is about bringing all of these things together holistically. And why is that important? Because you basically need all of these things working together to make process at the same time. It's no good doing piecemeal bits of work within this. You need to find a way to pull these things together as a holistic solution. But even offering these things holistically, you're still really in danger of not solving the root causes, the stuff that I've talked about, time, capacity, and capability. So here's the big difference. We don't just give you the resources and leave you to figure it out. We essentially do the heavy lifting. We get our hands dirty, as I suppose one way to put it. And this is a combination of working with you, in some cases, doing the work, with the purpose to essentially accelerate you towards your goal, to the outcome where you want to be. Now, this can include many different things, and it is based on the trust itself. So when we get involved in this approach, we start by asking lots of questions. We want to understand the context. We want to understand your current progress. We want to understand your resource, what systems you use, how all of these things come together. And based on that, we look at some of the things that we can do to take that burden away. So that could be creating new workforce policies. It could be delivering training, both generally or speciality specific, around what good job planning or workforce planning looks like. It's around engaging with stakeholders, service leads, sort of board level trust members. It's about running regular clinics and hand-holding sometimes individuals to improve things like job planning and where you get your data from and how that data is aggregated and where it eventually sits and how accessible it is. It's about utilizing systems as tools, job planning systems, capacity and demand tools. It's about flipping the traditional, what was known as SaaS, software as a service, and turning it into what we call SWAS, weird name, but software with a service. People don't have the time to really get into how these systems can best support this process. So the best way to deal with that, again, is a hands-on approach. How can we help make this system really valuable to you, to make the outputs valuable to you, and to ensure that you can utilize these things in a repeatable way without intervention in the future? It also includes things like communication, making sure the right messages are being sent out. And then finally, things like diagnostic health checks, sort of forensic level data analytics to see where you are and also to see where you need to be. So the addition of heavy lifting is important. There is one other area that is equally important. But as I said, the focus here is on giving the trust more time, capacity, and capability. And in order to get there, what you really need is a few extra pairs of hands, but you don't want them to be around all the time. But you want people who specialize in doing this, who bring the expertise, who essentially bring their own tools. At the moment, we have a situation where you, and excuse one of my analogies, where you want an extension built. And in the NHS, the way in which this tends to happen in that scenario is the builder turns up, they drop off the materials and the tools and the blueprint, and then they leave. And you have to build the extension. What we're trying to achieve is, well, let's build the extension with you or for you. We're trying to go back to that sort of traditional method of actually producing something for you. And that really is the core of this. It's about tangible outcomes. It's not abstract. It's not guidance. It's actually real things that you can see, use from this point forward, but it's also sustainable. And I will get into the sustainability thing as we go through. Without wanting to labour the point, I just wanted to give you a really brief example of one of the reasons why we got to this. We built a demand and capacity system and we showed it to a lot of people, and they all said the same thing. They said it's a game changer. And that's a great thing to hear when you've developed something, you've hit the nail on the head. But why weren't people buying it? And I think the reason they weren't buying it is because they wanted the outcome, and all they could see is the burden and the complexity and the time it would take to utilize that tool to get them to where they wanted to be. So our focus is helping people to reach that outcome quickly, not handing you a map or a set of tools. And that's why we focus on removing the mountain so you can get to where you need to be without any necessary hurdles. So what does it look like in terms of outcome mechanics? We talked about what outcomes people wanted: consistency, oversight, engagement, sustainability, productivity. And I'll just run through a couple of areas within this about what these elements are. So consistency is obviously essential in workforce planning, because what you're hoping to do is to create a picture of your planned capacity. And in order to do that, you need to have data that is easy to understand, to access, and to interrogate. So it needs to be comparable. And that's where the core activity language side of things, or CAL as I will refer to it. So CAL is essentially a predefined set of categories and activities that provides common language in the job planning arena. You know, if you do DCCs, what are the subcategories and the activities attached to that? It may be familiar to you, it may not be. Often we see job plans where someone will put down a number of PAs for DCC that just says clinic. Now, we're not questioning whether or not an individual is delivering a clinic, but in order for this to be meaningful, we need to know what clinic. We need to be able to define that so we can work out where resources is allocated. So this core activity language, which isn't just one set of generic language for everyone, there are obviously differentiators between specialities and services, but it is essentially there to ensure that everyone across departments is able to put their activities in consistently. And without this, as I say, it's impossible to have a clear, comparable picture of your workforce capacities. So it exists to make meaningful, consistent job plans. And once everyone's sort of speaking the same language, you can better align your resource to the actual demand on your service. But again, with anything, this needs to be supported. You need people to understand what it is, why it's there, and why it's important. So as part of the approach, the holistic approach, it is about supporting that, not just saying, here's your language, get on with it. The next area in here is oversight. And this is, again, I think these are all integral, but it's integral in terms of good workforce planning requires that oversight, but not just any kind of oversight. We're talking about forensic level management information, which needs to be accessible at a service level. It needs to be accessible at a board level as well, to ensure that you understand fully what is going on. So the way in which it works for us is that we essentially look at this data at a forensic level. So let's take demand and capacity as an example. We would look at the capacity, we would look at the demand, we would look at it in a level that talked about how much in-clinic admin time is there, how much post-clinic admin time is there, what's the traditional length of a clinic, what's the DNA rate, all of this information, so we can put it together and give you a forensic level piece of information that says, right, this is what that looks like in your organization. It's a granular look at what's happening, and it should show you exactly where you are, where the gaps are, and what needs to change. Now, our approach, and there may be others that differ, is that it doesn't matter which system you use. This isn't a use a SARD system and then we can do this work. It's completely system agnostic, as it should be, because all systems exist with data in them, and it's about how you utilize that. And the reason why I think people see it as a game changer is because it moves your workforce planning from what is essentially a gut feeling to data-driven decisions. And there's a massive difference with regards to that. And having that information allows you to make evidence-based strategic workforce decisions because you have the information in front of you. It's accessible with that oversight. The third point on here is around engagement. And this is, again, something we hear a lot people ask the question, well, how do you get the engagement? Well, it's definitely one of the biggest challenges when it comes to workforce planning, because if you don't have engagement, you don't have a full picture, and then it's very difficult to draw conclusions from that. And I think one of the clear ways to do this is through a mixture of training. So what does good look like? I think it's about clear policies, but I think most importantly, it's about focusing on outcomes. People need to understand why they're going through this process. I think that what we hear again and again and again is this cultural resistance of low engagement, which is essentially it feels like an admin task. I don't understand where the data goes. I don't understand how it impacts on service objectives, service deliveries, the ask that's coming in, the demand, and it feels like it's a compliance exercise. But actually, it's about connecting staff to the bigger picture. And we see it a lot in trust. It's something people often question, are you going to be able to turn this around? Well, it's surprisingly how easy it can be when people do understand why they're undertaking a process and how it does have a positive impact on their ability to deliver patient care and meet those service objectives. It should have a direct impact on their work, the burden of their work, and as I said, patient care. And as such, they're far more likely to engage fully within the process then. Sustainability, again, is key. I think when I talk about these approaches, there's an obvious concern, which is we're just pushing the burden from ourselves to an external organization. And are we going to become reliant on them to deliver this year on year on year? And I think that is where the sustainability side of things and the approach and the focus is really, really important, because none of you in this room, none of you making decisions about your workforce planning process want to rely on external help forever. I think you want to be able to undertake this process independently. And one of the biggest issues comes back to the mountain and the sinking boat issue, which is you need to be able to remove that mountain. You need to be able to buy yourself more time and capacity, and in some cases capability, to be able to get to the point where it's a manageable, repeatable process year on year. So with us, when we run a program, the tangible outcomes are not just you've got team job planning, you don't have any uncodified spend, you know what people are doing. It's about making sure that as the process is undertaken, that skill is transferred, whether it be to service leads, whether it be to people in the board, whether it be to people that are administering systems. It's making sure that when we've accelerated a trust to where they want to be, we can essentially leave, or mostly leave, but what we do is we leave behind the tools that we've used, which you will have been trained on and you will understand. We leave behind some of the support as well, but also we hopefully leave behind a really good legacy of a great policy, great understanding of engagement, great understanding of how to utilize the data, where to get it from, where to put it. And then it's really a case of, well, we're just a touch point then for when potentially people change roles or new people and they need a little bit of support. So that's what sustainability really looks like for us. It's not about trying to create a market space where we have to be there all the time. I often say this to colleagues, but I think any company or provider that professes to be in the problem solving business, their core aim, the core intention of where they should be aiming to be at is to make themselves redundant. Because problem solving is not holding a problem up and continually just to chip away. It's actually trying to solve that problem. And that's certainly where our approach is. It's removing those barriers, but then removing ourselves as a barrier in the future. And it's not about fixing things for today. It's about building those systems and processes that can grow with your organization, that you can repeat year after year without sort of any major further intervention from organizations like ourselves. So it's setting yourself up for real long-term success, I think. Um, and the last bit, obviously, the last element outcome is the productivity. Um, and this really is a product of all of the elements above it. Um, but as I mentioned before, optimization in our current climate is not about a solution being able to plug every single gap. It's really about providing you with the information to be able to best utilize your resource and understand the areas that you need to potentially invest in. So it's right sizing. So you can allocate that resource more efficiently. You could potentially reduce waste. And that may be our clinics running the way they should be. Do we understand what the throughput is? Can we bring down waiting lists? Where do we need to invest? And as I mentioned before, this is more than just sort of squeezing blood out of a stone. This is more than just putting more on people. It's making sure your workforce is structured and aligned with the demand on your services. And as an end result of that, you should have a more productive, more efficient organization that's focus is delivering that high quality care, but without overburdening your staff. So as I mentioned before, these are not abstract goals. These are actionable. They're sort of concrete outcomes driven by data training and smart decision making. And they should build the foundations for your long-term success, which essentially looks like you're no longer managing the problem, you're solving it. Just a couple of more areas, and I'll quickly get into the case studies in a second, is I wanted to talk about ethical first as well, because I think that a question we often get asked is workforce optimization about saving money? Well, in some ways, yes, it can be, but that should not be the main focus. I think Brian, who's with us today, will describe it as realistic workforce planning, and as such, it needs to be ethical. It's not just about filling gaps or cutting costs. And I think a lot of consultancies get a bad name because they suggest optimization is about cutting staff or increasing workloads. And whilst this may save money short term, it often compromises those key things: patient safety, staff well-being, and can lead to burnout and reduced care quality, essentially. So when we think about return on investment on this, I think the real value, the real thing that you get isn't the traditional financial return. As I say, in some of the examples I'm going to show you, it can be, but it's the really clear management information, because that management information leads you to be able to make the right decisions on where you invest, where you reallocate, to make sure that you focus on the key areas that you should, which you can see in front of you on the screen: patient safety, staff safety and well-being, patient outcomes, transparency and fairness, making sure things are equitable. So it's not about quick fixes, it's about long term. Now, I appreciate that saving money is really important because there is a big pressure on it. And most people will have been asked to find savings somewhere, but it is a false economy. And I would also argue that an organised, productive workforce should cost less than a disorganised one. I think I was chatting to a colleague the other day who was telling me, and this was in the nursing profession, that the number 2 reason for nurses leaving the profession is exhaustion. So if we try to do more with less, we're just going to lead to more burnout and more people leaving. And that's something obviously we wish to avoid. So I think when you're thinking about this sort of approach, it cannot be just about saving money. There will be inevitably some areas where you can, but it has to be about patient safety and staff well-being. So let's put this into the real world and briefly talk about some case studies of areas that we've been in. Now, I'm not going to name the trusts because this is a video that's going to be accessible to lots of people, but we're happy to provide certainly our case studies to anyone who wants to see them. But let's have a look at this. So we went into a urology department, and the issue was it was struggling with a backlog of over 1,200 new patient appointments, which was essentially driven by growing outpatient demand and misaligned capacity across the service. The ask was to bring in two new consultants, and I think that the medical director was skeptical that they needed it. So through data analytics and using demand and capacity systems, we essentially found out a couple of things. One, that the department had excessive capacity in theatres, but it lacked the sufficient resource in outpatient clinics, where the backlog was actually most critical. And initially, as I said, the trust was looking to add consultants, but we determined that actually the 3.6 additional programme activities, PAs, required could be covered by a mix of staff. So it didn't need those two consultants. And by realigning that capacity from the theatres to the clinics and adjusting the staffing model, the trust not only addressed the backlog, but it also realised some potential cost saving through more efficient resource allocation. That's one example. Let's move on to a different one. This is acute elderly medicine. And in this case study, we worked with a out of London teaching trust and their elderly medicine department, which was facing significant variability in how job plans were managed. The department relied heavily on agency doctors. I think there was about 29 senior doctors and half of them were agency staff, about 15. And the trust really wanted to understand how many whole-time equivalencies were needed to provide safe and sustainable patient care. So again, we started with data analytics, and then we moved into the demand and capacity side of things and team job planning, and it helped the trust clarify how much senior clinical time was required for ward-based fertility and acute medical services. The result, by aligning the capacity and demand and optimizing their resources, resource planning, the trust was able to reduce its reliance on agency staff by 2 whole-time equivalencies, which is a lot of money generally, but obviously we were able to reduce that from the agency side, and it was roughly a saving of about £400,000 a year. So it not only saved costs, but it provided some clear visibility around their staffing needs moving forward to ensure that sustainability. And the final case study here was around acute rheumatology. And actually this was in the busiest rheumatology department in the UK, and it served a huge number of outpatient referrals and follow-up appointments. However, as is quite common, they were struggling with backlog, over 2,700 new patients and 1,000 follow-ups, which was putting immense pressure on their team. We talked about burnout. So the solution, again, using job planning diagnostics, looking at demand and capacity through team job planning tools, we determined that the department was significantly under-resourced. And to meet the patient demand and eliminate the backlog, we recommended increasing the team by 3 additional staff members, a consultant, a mid-grade, and a specialist nurse. And I wanted to put this one in there because I think the first 2 talk about savings, and that is important, but I've also talked about the ethical nature of job planning. And in this situation, things were not good, and it needed investment. So it was about aligning their staff with demand, but also setting them on this sustainable path where they could clear that backlog and then get to the point where they're providing high quality patient care. So that gives you sort of 3 different case studies. Yes, they're all in acute. We have worked across mental health as well, but I don't have enough time to go through all of those, but it gives you some 3 real world examples. Before we move on to any questions that people may be waiting to ask, just want to give a brief summary of the stuff that I've talked about this morning. So the first one is root causes, not surface solutions. We've seen how common approaches can often fail because they don't address these root issues of time, capacity, and capability. And you need to tackle these fundamental barriers first. That you need an outcome-driven approach. So you need to focus on outcomes, not just on inputs. Inputs are important, but it's getting to the end goal that you need to focus on. So by aligning resources to demand, ensuring consistency through things like core activity language, by leveraging forensic data analysis, it's about delivering actionable insights and therefore sustainable results. That there should be a focus on holistic and hands-on support. Unlike traditional systems that often lead you to build the extension yourself, it's about, can you get a holistic approach? Can you get someone to build it for you and then you can maintain it? Someone who's willing to do the heavy lifting, with the expertise and the tools to be able to actually provide a quality job. Then we talked about not forgetting the ethical side of workforce planning. What is the mission of the NHS? It's around patient outcomes and patient safety, and it should be looking after its own staff's well-being. So we need to make sure that any approach that we take bears that in mind, and it's not purely a financial exercise, because that will only exacerbate the problem in the future. And then finally, we talked about how some of this looks in the real world, what some of the challenges were, what some of the solutions were, and what some of the results to those challenges were. So I am going to stop talking. I know we barely got any time, but if there's any questions, can someone alert me and I'll answer them as briefly as possible.
Apparently. Great job, Bill. I did have a question that came before. So you mentioned the core activity language. How does SARD provide the language to trusts, and how do trusts kind of access it if they want to do so?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways. So obviously we have the data sets, the core activity language data sets, which we can just provide to a trust that they can then utilize within their systems. We can also offer essentially a service around making sure that that information is embedded in the system. If it was within a SARD system, we could obviously update the system to make sure it reflected that core activity language. It isn't as simple as just putting it in. You've got to make sure that people understand it, it aligns with what your current sort of ways of working are. But it is imperative to have these different layers of categories, subcategory, and activity, so you've actually got good data. So there's numerous ways in which you can get core activity language in, basically.
And a question from Matt here. How do you begin the process if all trusts are likely to be starting from different positions and of different needs and abilities? From that.
Yeah, well, I think that the first thing is I've done a lot of talking today and telling you what we've heard, and that's the really important part. Is we always start with a discovery meeting. We want to start by listening to things like what's the current context, what are your current individual barriers, what's your unique situation, what progress have you made, what internal resource have you got. So the starting point is based on where you are at as a trust or a service, rather than a one size fits all, this is what we do. Things are tailored and bespoke to meet the requirements. Some trusts have made really high engagement in job planning, but they struggle with the demand side of things. So that focus is obviously completely different to a trust that may score their workforce planning process as a whole as a 0, that may not have good job planning capability at this point. So in terms of how we begin the process, we literally start by asking really pertinent, important questions to find out where you're at and where you what we need to help you with to get you to your ultimate goal. Thank you for those who've got to go. I don't know if there's any other questions or not. If not, this recording will be available to you, and we'll also make it available to people that could not attend. So I would like to thank people very much for coming. I'm happy to address any questions outside of this. I'll hang around if anyone's got any questions beyond this, but if not, we're at 12. So thank you for your patience and your time. I hope it was useful for everybody.